case of the murder of Mary Ann Hogg and the attack on her sister one summer's day in Camberley in Surrey in 1906 remains an unsolved mystery. Officially, at least. The police had a suspect. The coroner and the inquest jury had their suspicions. But someone got away with murder. My research into this case has been hampered by the lack of a Scotland Yard file or even a Surrey police file on the matter. I've had to rely, therefore, on the report of the inquest, on newspapers and other secondary sources, which is never wholly satisfactory. But nevertheless, there is enough, I think, to arrive at an understanding of what happened.
It was around 4:20 p.m. on the 11th of June 1906. The weather was fine. The leafy suburban road in Camberley, Surrey, was quiet. So the neighbours of 53-year-old Caroline Hogg were greatly surprised to see her run from the grounds of her home, Heathfield, in London Road, clutching her throat, calling out, "I'm murdered! I'm murdered!" Caroline ran to a neighbouring house, Dullator, whose occupant, Mrs. Wilding, came to her assistance. She was bleeding and distressed, but she was able to utter the words, "My sister, my sister." Her doctor, Herbert E. Rayner, was called in by Mrs. Wilding, and two other doctors, Cadell and Scott, were called in too. A neighbour, Colonel Lonsdale Augustus Hale, late of the Royal Engineers, strode round to the house to inform Mary Ann Hogg of her sister's injuries, and found the door slightly ajar. He entered, and here he found Mary Ann Hogg lying on the hall floor with a wound to her head and a deep gash to her throat. She was lying on her side, her head face upwards, about 18 inches from a grandfather clock beside the door. She was obviously dead. He called in another man from the street outside, a coachman called Woodley, and as he did so, a police constable Holdaway arrived. Together the men went through the house. The drawing-room was undisturbed, the dining-room laid out for a meal for one. The door to the garden was closed, and there were no traces of an intruder about the place. A 4-inch claw-hammer was found in the dead woman's hand, though, which fell to the floor as soon as she was touched. It was broken, and the shaft lay 5 feet from the woman's feet, and some merino cloth, which was heavily blood-stained. Dr. Rayner treated Caroline Hogg's injuries, which upon examination were not considered to be life-threatening. Her wounds were dressed, and she was admitted to a local nursing home for further care. Her sister Mary was removed to Frimley Mortuary. Mary Ann Hogg was born on the 29th of December, 1837, at 4 George Street, Marylebone, London, the daughter of physician Dr. John Hogg and his wife Mary Elizabeth, née Roberts. She was the second of 8 children, and after her mother died when she was just 5, her father married again and had a further daughter, Caroline, on the 12th of January, 1853. It was these two half-sisters, born 16 years apart, who lived at Heathfield House in Camberley together, and at the time of the murder, Mary, the dead woman, was 68 years old, and Caroline was 53. It seems to have been circumstances which had brought these two sisters together in domestic cohabitation. Neither had married, although it was said the elder, Mary, had suffered a disappointment in love some years before. It was claimed that both sisters were wealthy, but some who knew them claimed that their father's wealth had been inherited chiefly by the younger sister, Caroline. By comparison, Mary had very little money at all. A small annuity was her sole means of living, and the generosity of her younger half-sister, with whom she had lived for most of her life. Caroline herself subsequently confirmed this state of affairs, and told the inquest that she had money, and her sister depended on her. But this wasn't true. In fact, Mary had a healthy fortune of her own, which exceeded that of her younger sister. The pair first came to Camberley in the 1880s, and took a house called the Villa there, before going to live in Yokohama in Japan, where they spent most of their time living at the Grand Hotel, and were well known as a pair of eccentric European ladies who dressed rather shabbily. They spent time in Singapore and Hong Kong too, and their brother, a colonel in India, occasionally visited them. In September 1903 they again returned to Britain, once more to Camberley, then a genteel watering hole for retired military officers, and took Heathfield House on London Road. This was a large house spread over 3 floors, and sat in an acre of grounds with a coach-house and stables. Both women had separate bedrooms and dressing-rooms, and had very different manners of living. Mary seems to have been practical, and kept what would be regarded by most as being normal hours, rising at an early hour, making their meals, doing the housework, and retiring to her bedroom at an early hour in the evening. Caroline, by contrast, had pretensions to being a writer and artist, never rose before noon, and stayed up well into the early hours. Following the discovery of Mary's body, news of the murder spread quickly. A great many police officers, doctors, and others arrived at Heathfield House, and a small crowd gathered in London Road, agog with the news of violence and murder committed in the small town of Camberley, where nothing much ever really happened. Officers believed that the 4-inch claw-hammer, which was loosely held in Mary's hand so that it fell as soon as she was touched, had been purposely placed there. They believed also that the blood-stained piece of merino cloth found nearby had been wrapped around the head of the claw-hammer to muffle the blows. The long shaft of this, which was broken, and found lying 5 feet from Mary's feet, was thought to have been broken during the assault. No knife or sharp implement which might account for the 2 women's cut throats could be discovered in the room, however. An Inspector Frederick Fox of Scotland Yard was called in by the Chief Constable, Captain Sant, to take the lead in the inquiry. He acquainted himself with the details and the locality, and quickly assimilated the facts of the case. He found the house to be generally untidy, but there were no signs that it had been ransacked by an intruder. In the dining-room there were 5 or 6 drawers opened, but although valuables were clearly visible, nothing appeared to have been touched. Silverware and plate were on display there too. There was also a gold sovereign in an Indian bowl on the sideboard, so prominent that police were surprised it had not been taken. There was a blood trail leading to the scullery in the basement, where there were blood splashes on the walls and floor. A basin of water on a table there had clearly been used to wash bloodied hands, and a damp towel to dry them on. No doors other than the front door indicated any means of exit for the intruder, and no bloodstains were discovered outside the house. Dr. Cadell was the first medical man to examine the body of Mary Ann Hogg, and he expressed his opinion that as the body was still warm, death had not occurred more than an hour before. It was 5:15 p.m. when he examined the body, so this placed the time of death at about 4:15 p.m. And Mrs. Trethaway, a local housekeeper, said she had seen Mary at 3:25 p.m. that afternoon, looking out of an upper window of the house, and upon realizing she had been observed, Mary quickly withdrew. Mrs. Trethaway thought it odd. This would have been less than an hour before she was attacked downstairs. Caroline Hogg was interviewed by police as soon as she had received treatment. She said that her sister had entered her bedroom between 2 and 3 and had told her she had cancelled the carriage Caroline had hired for 5:30 that afternoon, because the weather looked threatening. Caroline said she was sorry for it. Mary then left the room and went downstairs without further conversation. Caroline gave several different accounts of the story, which exasperated and frustrated the authorities throughout the course of the investigations, but the gist of her story was this. She said she had got out of bed between 3 and 4 and heard a cry or exclamation from her sister from downstairs, and so went out onto the landing. At the top of the stairs she met a man who had a net over his head. He said to her, "I want money." She replied, "The money is downstairs." Both he and she then rushed downstairs, although she wasn't sure which of them went first. Sometimes it was him, sometimes her. In one account she met him halfway down the stairs. She was intending to go into the dining room or out through the front door and seek assistance. There was confusion over which, but as she entered the hall she saw the front door was open, and her sister Mary was in the front garden facing the door, blood streaming from her face. She went towards her sister when the man struck her from behind, and she fell down. It was now that she noticed he had a weapon, a pickaxe or hammer with a long handle in his hand, she said. He swung it with both hands. Mary came in from the garden, saw Caroline lying on the floor, and exclaimed, "Oh!" Caroline now struggled to the door and out of the house. She said she didn't know when her throat had been cut, but thought it might have been at the door. She ran out into the road and got help. She did not see her sister again. An inquest was opened on the 13th of June at the White Hart Hotel in Frimley, under the West Surrey coroner, George Frederick Romier, at which brief details of the deceased were given, and Colonel Lonsdale Augustus Hale identified her as being Mary Ann Hogg, whom he knew. "Was the deceased of independent means?" inquired the coroner. "I hardly know how to answer the question," replied Hale. "I believe the other had the money. In fact, I know it. This one had very little money." Colonel Hale was wrong, but clearly believed this disparity in the two women's respective wealth as a matter of fact. The inquest was then adjourned until the 25th of June for inquiries to be made by police. On the 19th of June, the body of Mary Ann Hogg was taken from Frimley to Waterloo in London, and thence conveyed to Highgate Cemetery for a brief service and interment in the family plot. There were just 4 mourners, 2 of whom were her solicitor, Mr. E.T. Close, and her physician, Dr. Herbert Rayner. Caroline was able to give police a description of the man who had attacked her and her sister. He was, she said, about 35 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall, had dark eyes, a red complexion, sleeves tucked up, and had the appearance of being a respectable working man, like a bricklayer. This description was widely circulated and issued to press in the hope of apprehending the man. The failure of the man to take anything of value, silver and plate, which was abundant in the house, as well as cash, suggested to police that the man might be a lunatic. Police visited Broadmoor Asylum for the Insane, which was just 4 miles away, and made inquiries. But there were no escapees, no one had been released, they were assured. Next door to Heathfield, where a croquet party had been held that afternoon, the occupants told police of a strange man dressed in a brown coat who appeared at the rear of their house. But the circumstances of the man wearing a brown coat seemed not to tally with the man in his shirt sleeves whom Caroline had described. Other odd sightings of various people, an elderly man cutting his nails with a razor, and itinerant people observed in the locality, were investigated but came to nothing. One man even handed himself in to police, confessing to the murder, but it soon became clear that he knew nothing whatever of the matter, and he was sent on his way. The grounds of the house were searched by Inspector Fox and his men for a sharp knife, and police dug up some areas in the garden in the hope of finding it, but nothing was discovered of this. The press made much of a bloodstain found on the front gate, but this was not, it seems, accorded much value by police, since it was not raised at inquest. It also seemed to be at odds with the notion that the killer had washed his hands and dried them before leaving the house, and it was considered extremely unlikely the killer could have exited from the front gate, as he would have been seen by those congregating in the road 2 doors along. Furthermore, if there was a bloodstain on the gate, then it had almost certainly come from Caroline. Then Inspector Fox discovered a black-handled kitchen knife in the scullery, which appeared to have traces of blood on it, and had been washed and dried recently. He concluded that this was the weapon used, and it had been subsequently cleaned and returned to its proper place. An act of concealment. Along with the hammer, which was believed to have been placed in the dead woman's hand, it suggested that the killer had sought to conceal their crime. Why? Professor Augustus Pepper, Home Office pathologist, conducted a post-mortem on the body, and gave his opinion that Mary had been felled from behind by several powerful blows administered by the claw-hammer, which had been wrapped in the merino fabric, and that her throat had then been severed by a deep gash administered by a sharp implement. Inquiries by police concerning the 2 women confirmed the general view of them as being eccentric. They seldom had any visitors, and when anyone called on them, they were kept on the doorstep, and any conversation took place at the door. No one was invited into the house. And Mrs. Bridges had some association with them, was called a great friend of the women by the newspapers at the time, but this is almost certainly an exaggeration. Mrs. Bridges was not called to give evidence at inquest, and the women seemed to keep themselves to themselves. They had a servant called Mrs. Evans until November 1905. She said both women were strong-minded, and described the women's daily routine as follows. Mary got up first and took breakfast to her sister in bed. Caroline remained in bed until around 2 p.m. Then Mary went out shopping. It was a source of irritation to Caroline that when Mary went out, she left the door unlocked, according to Mrs. Evans. They had tea later in the afternoon and a large dinner. Caroline stayed up late painting and writing, while Mary went to bed. When Mrs. Evans left their employment, the women didn't take on another help, and looked after the house themselves. Or rather, the elder sister, Mary, did so, because Caroline was said to be an invalid. Nothing was mentioned at inquest of Caroline's physical condition, nor by any of the doctors who attended her, other than remarking on the wounds she had suffered in the attack on the 11th of June. So any disabilities she possessed were, presumably, not remarkable. She was rather portly, though, and was unable to tie her own shoelaces, it was said. It is certainly the case, too, that it was the elder sister, now deceased, Mary, who did all the housework. It seems she was also required to bring her sister her breakfast in bed each day, which was usually between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. She would then lay the table for them to have tea and prepare dinner. The 2 women did shopping together, and Mary carried a string net bag for the items they purchased. They discussed everything they bought, squabbled over them, it was said. They were thrifty and eccentric ladies. A gardener they employed 1 day a week, called Williams, told police the women made journeys at night over the Barossa Common. They were invariably shabbily dressed, and wore old-fashioned clothes, better suited to the middle of the century. The inquest reconvened on the 25th of June, but was unable to make progress because Caroline was still said to be suffering from her injuries. So it was further adjourned until the 10th of July 1906, when it was in a position to call all the witnesses required. The first witness called was John Henry Cumner, a builder's labourer who had been working on a house in the avenue off London Road and close to Heathfield House on the 11th of June. He and his brother, Christopher, said they had seen the hammer at 6 a.m. on the morning of the 11th of June. They didn't miss it for several days, when Sergeant Mears had shown the hammer to John Henry Cumnor, and he had confirmed it was his, although he knew nothing of the merino cloth which was believed to have been wrapped around it. He had owned the hammer for 10 years, he said, and known of it for 20 years. Next to be called was Caroline Hogg, dressed in black mourning, with a heavy black veil, and even black bandages around her throat, according to the press, accompanied by a nurse and another woman. She was pale and ill-looking, and spoke in a faint voice. The coroner asked her, "What time did you get up on the day in question?" "It was late, between 2 and 3, she replied. "Did you see your sister during the Monday morning, or in the early afternoon of the 11th? "Yes, she came into my bedroom between 2 and 3. "What time had you arranged to go for a drive?" "Between 5 and half-past. "Did she say anything about getting up?" "No, she went downstairs. She said Mary said she had a headache and had put the carriage off, as she did not think it was fine enough to go for a drive." Caroline then got dressed, and afterwards heard an exclamation in the hall, which she thought sounded like her sister. She went out of her room, and at the top of the stairs encountered a man who said, "I want money." She said, "The money is downstairs." He was dressed as a bricklayer, with his sleeves tucked up, and he had a light-coloured net over his face. We both rushed down together, but I cannot tell you who went first. I think I got in front of him, and that he followed me. I saw my sister in the garden in front of the house, with blood streaming from her face. I was going towards her when he felled me down. He struck me with the hammer. "What happened?" inquired the coroner. "My sister came in from the garden. I fell to the ground, close to the clock. I heard my sister exclaim, 'Oh!' I think he had stunned her. My hair, thick and long, was coiled round my head where the blows were struck, and this, I think, saved me." The coroner then told her that she had made a good many statements to different people, and quoted from one she had made to Inspector Fox. "I went to the dining-room to find my sister. Is that right?" "I went towards the dining-room door," said Caroline, "but the man struck me close to the clock. It was when I was by the clock that I saw my sister." Mr. Romier was becoming irritable with Caroline's evidence, and said, "What I want to know is this. You have made so many different statements, and I remind you, you're on oath now. I want to see which is correct. Did you run into the garden?" "Yes, we all went into the garden." "What, all 3 of you?" exclaimed the coroner. "Yes, as far as the doorstep. I rushed to the gate to get assistance. I do not know what happened to my sister. It all happened in half a minute." The coroner said, "And yet you were able to notice that the man had a red face and dark eyes?" "That was downstairs, and I was quite well then," replied Caroline. She said that she and her sister had been prevented from leaving the front door by the man. The coroner inquired, "How did he prevent you?" "He pushed us with his bare arms," said Caroline. "I got out finally. I don't think my sister's throat was cut at that time." The coroner said, "You told the magistrate that the man followed you into the garden and beat you about the head." Caroline replied, "I do not think he did." "You said it was something like a battle-axe," persisted the coroner. "It had a long handle. He swung it with both hands," replied Caroline. Further questioned, she told the court that a purse with 17 or 18 shillings in it and a George III prayer book were missing from the house. This was the first time these items had been mentioned, and caused a stir in court. She also said she thought the man was disguised. The press noted the testimony of Caroline under the banner, "Sisters' Graphic but Contradictory Evidence." The pathologist, Professor Pepper, was then called and stated that Mary's injuries involved a number of blows to her head, which would have rendered her unconscious. Her skull had not been fractured, and he attributed this to the fact that the hammer had been wrapped in merino cloth, which muffled the effect of its blows. The wound to her throat had been very deep, administered left to right, probably from behind, by a right-handed person, while Mary was unconscious. The injuries to Mary and Caroline showed great similarity, he said, and exhibited all the appearances of being murder and attempted murder. Questioned, he said the injuries to the deceased could have been inflicted by another woman. He also said that the wounds to Mary were much more likely to have been murder than those to Caroline. He believed that one or both ladies had been in the scullery after some of the blows had been inflicted. He was quite sure one of the wounded persons had been in the scullery. In reply to a question from one of the jury members concerning the fact that Caroline had seen her sister in the garden with blood streaming from her face, he said, "I have heard her evidence, and as a medical man I should say her statement is not at all reliable." Another jury member said, "You consider Miss Caroline Hogg's evidence is somewhat inconsistent?" "Yes," he replied. Another jury member inquired, "Could one woman have inflicted all of the injuries?" Pepper replied, "Yes." Dr. Neville P. Cadell described the bloodstains on the ground floor of the house and basement, and the bowl of water in the scullery, and the towel used by the killer to wash their hands. He also thought more than one cut with an instrument had been made across the dead woman's throat. The jury retired and returned with a verdict of wilful murder against a person or persons unknown, stating that there was insufficient evidence to show by whom it was committed. This was the end of the matter, an unsatisfactory end, one in which a woman had been brutally murdered and another seriously injured on a quiet afternoon in Camberley, Surrey. There was, of course, a great deal of forensic evidence available which would undoubtedly have supplied a definitive answer to the mystery today. But in 1906, making allowance for the state of forensic science, and perhaps even more importantly, the resources police had available to them to handle such inquiries, we are bound to rely on the information we have, second or third-hand information, with huge gaping holes in it. With this in mind, there are a number of features in this case which are highly suggestive. First, the dead woman was the wealthier woman, not the poorer, as Colonel Hale and Caroline both asserted. Far from being impoverished, her probate was valued at £5,293 later that year, which was left in its entirety to her younger sister. That is the equivalent of £822,000 in 2025. The elder Miss Hogg was not, it seems, a poor woman, but rather a wealthy one. We do not know what her sister Caroline was worth at this time, but she would eventually leave a sum of £8,000 in 1921, an approximate equivalent value of £500,000 in 2025. A substantially lesser sum, which presumably includes the sum her sister Mary had bequeathed to her. Unfortunately, a great deal may have happened to her financial position in the period following her sister's death, so it is impossible to draw any substantial conclusion from this. But nevertheless, we know as a matter of fact that Mary was a wealthy woman at the time of her death, and it may have been the case that the greater part of the money was hers, and not Caroline's at all. Second, in spite of the fact Mary was 68 years old and Caroline just 53, it was Mary who did all the work around the house. She brought Caroline breakfast in bed, albeit at 2 p.m. She laid the dinner table, and Caroline said she expected dinner to be there for her when she rose. Expected it. Her words. It is a little mystifying. They had no servant, and Mary had, effectively, taken on the role. Why? Does it suggest a perceived relative difference in their respective finances? And was Mary unhappy with this? Third, there are hints of friction between the pair. It was said variously that they didn't speak often, that when they went shopping together they argued over what to buy, how much to buy, and what to buy. The pair lived in a pleasant suburban house amongst retired officers and the like, yet they lived a somewhat impoverished existence, were noted only for their shabbiness and eccentric habits. They didn't appear to socialize with others. When asked whether she got on well with her sister, Caroline's answer was equivocal. She said they got on quite well most of the time. That is not quite the response one would expect from a grieving sister. 4. Mary had a hammer in her hand. It appeared to have been placed there, according to those who saw it. The only motive for a killer doing this would be to mislead the police. Yet why would a third person, an outsider, have any interest in placing a hammer in his victim's hand? She had hardly cut her own throat and then proceeded to knock herself about the head with a hammer. And would they have had the opportunity for this? Mary was still standing in the hallway when Caroline ran out into the front garden and out by the gate to the road, calling out for help. Was it possible for the killer to have struck Mary and cut her throat while Caroline was running into the street, then to have placed the murder weapon in her hand? For what purpose? The other object of his attack had fled into the street, would inform people of what had occurred. He hardly had time to waste on the pointless exercise of putting the murder weapon into his victim's hand. It accomplished nothing but to waste time, time which had suddenly become very precious to a killer. 5. The trail of blood led down to the scullery in the basement. Here a basin of bloodied water was found, and a towel which indicated that the killer had washed their hands after committing the murder, but before leaving the house. Why would an outsider do such a thing? His attempt to rob the women had failed. He had been defeated. He had killed one woman, but the other had run into the street calling for help. His discovery was now imminent. Yet he went downstairs into the basement, washed his hands and dried them before exiting the house. Professor Pepper said that he was sure that one of the two women had gone down into the scullery after the attack. He did not say why he thought this, but it may be assumed he meant because it was the only reasonable way to account for the blood in the basin and the damp towel and fingerprints and other blood stains. Splashes on the wall, too, suggested part of the attack had occurred in the basement scullery. If Pepper's account is correct, then it is most unlikely that there was an intruder at all. How likely is it that one or both women would have gone to the scullery to wash themselves while a murderer was lurking about the place? 6. Why did the man apparently open drawers in the dining room in which valuables were on display, yet take none? He even left a purse with money in one. Furthermore, a gold sovereign was visible in a bowl there, and had not been touched. He ignored the silverware and plate also. He gave no appearance of being interested in any of the valuables in the house, nor in the money. Yet he violently attacked two women, murdering one, and expended further time in the house to washing his hands. If the knife found was the weapon, then why would he wash this, dry it, and replace it in the drawer? The only person such concealment could possibly benefit would be the surviving sister. 7. Why did he murder Mary by cutting her throat, when he had already knocked her unconscious by several heavy blows to the head? It didn't serve any purpose if he was a robber. It only served his purpose if his objective was murder. Then the half-open, yet undisturbed drawers were merely for show, to give the appearance of a robbery. And if robbery was not the purpose of the attack, then the only person who could wish to harm the women was a lunatic or someone motivated by hatred. As a person who wears a mask to conceal their appearance, cleans a knife to conceal its use, places a hammer in one of his victim's hands, and washes his hands, cannot be considered to be completely deranged, but capable of taking great care to avoid detection. It seems probable that the motive in the attack was one of personal hatred. It was indeed a ferocious attack. But these two ladies kept themselves to themselves. They gave no one offence, because they interacted at no meaningful level with anyone, only with each other. The only place where intense feeling could develop and fester was in the relationship between the two women themselves. 8. The only fingerprints found were those of the women, which it was assumed the women had left while stumbling about being attacked. And yet, if the man had washed his hands, then he had bloody fingerprints about the place too. Why were these not discovered? Did he have time to locate and clean these too, selectively so? Or were the women's fingerprints simply the only ones present in the first place? 9. Caroline gave many different versions of what occurred, and this may be understandable, given the circumstances and trauma of the attack, which had led to the murder of her sister and her own injuries. But the accounts she gave are often quite impossible. She swore she had not entered the scullery at any time after the attack. Well, someone had. If it wasn't her, it was, as Pepper said, the man. And yet the idea that the man could have done so was deeply problematic. 10. She claimed to have seen Mary in the front garden facing the door, blood streaming from her face. The only reason she would have gone into the garden was to call assistance from the road. But she came back into the house instead. That seems wholly improbable. Pepper said it was impossible. She also said all three had gone into the garden at one point. "What, all together?" exclaimed the coroner, from which she rode back quickly. "Well, to the doorstep," she said. She went into the dining room, she told Inspector Fox. "I went towards the dining room," she said in court. But the dining room was on the left, its entrance directly opposite the front door. It is quite impossible that a misunderstanding of a crucial phrase could have been made to Fox. She was going towards the outer hall, towards the drawing room, towards the front door. The dining room was accessed via the hall and left by a short passageway. If she mentioned the dining room, then it must be assumed she meant the dining room, the only question being, why? In another version, she said she went downstairs intending to run out into the garden, a much more reasonable action for someone in her position. She is seeking others outside the house. In her first account, she encountered the man halfway down the stairs, in another at the top of the stairs. It was impossible to get, as the exasperated coroner pointed out, a straightforward account of what had happened. The reason for this is that she may have been muddled. Or it may have been that she was lying, and changed her account as problems with her account were presented to her. Thus, when the fact that the man had not taken anything from the house was presented to her as absurd, she decided a purse and a George III prayer book were missing. When her intention of going to the dining room was queried, she said she was going towards it, intending to go outside. When she says the man and herself rushed down the stairs, she cannot say which of them was in front, but finally decides she somehow got in front of him. It is absurd to conceive of her getting past the man on the stairs, yet it became essential for her to say so, to explain how she had managed to reach the front door. She said she was felled from behind as she exited the front door, but then said the man prevented the two sisters from escaping with his bare arms. All three went out into the front garden at one point, and then at another none did. They were all at the front doorstep. Her sister was in the front garden when she saw her, blood streaming from her head, and she came back in. Impossible, said Professor Pepper. In fact, every aspect of Caroline's account is contradictory and ultimately impossible. The story was, quite plainly, a complete fabrication. What happened in Camberley that summer day in 1906? On the morning of the 11th of June, all the conditions were conspiring to a certain outcome. These two unhappy women, half-sisters, forced into a domestic arrangement neither wished for, barely spoke. When they did, they quarrelled. They quarrelled over what to buy, what to pay, and every aspect of the domestic life. They lived like two squabblesome cats. They didn't go shopping together because they liked to do this together, but to watch each other. They were a miserly pair. Everyone spoke of it. We can see that in the fact that they had no household staff for the large house. We see it in their shabby mid-century clothes, their frugal shopping, in which Mary carried a net bag for their purchases. Did the net bag suggest to Caroline the net covering the putative attacker's face? Caroline said her sister was poor. She had the money, but it was untrue. Colonel Hale said he knew it for a fact. Both were wrong. Mary was, it seems, by far the wealthier of the pair. However, given that Colonel Hale said he knew it for a fact that she had money, he cannot have depended on Caroline for this information. He must have had it from Mary herself, or from a third party, for to carry such conviction with him. The fact that she lied about how much money she had was probably a means of ensuring her sister paid the lion's share of the household bill, the rent, etc. Mary was cheating her sister. Not that it afforded her a great deal of satisfaction, because although she tricked Caroline into paying the bills, Caroline ensured she got her money's worth in the household chores. That was their arrangement, quid pro quo. Mary, now 68, did the cleaning, the skivvying work of the maid, while her sister lay in bed until 2 or 3 p.m. She had to bring her sister breakfast in bed. Caroline even said that she expected Mary to have her dinner ready for her when she went downstairs. All of this must have been galling and humiliating for the older sister. And yet she had trapped herself in this situation by pleading poverty. Her sister's largesse came at a heavy price for Mary. The two women loathed each other in that way that enforced companionship feeds on the slightest affronts. They bickered all the time, trading slights. Mary left the door unlocked when she went out, according to the former servant, Mrs. Evans. It infuriated Caroline. "One day she'll come back and I'll be murdered," she said. She had words with her sister over it, but it didn't alter Mary's behaviour. It strengthened the effect of it. She left the door unlocked. It was an ongoing petty battle between them, one of many such battles. It consumed their petty lives. Even at inquest, the battle of vanities continued. Caroline spoke of her possessing all the money, her sister none. She spoke of her age. She said she expected her sister to wait on her. She even said she thought the hammer blows had not rendered her unconscious because of my long, thick hair. She must have bridled then at the press description of the odd couple favouring her sister, whom they described as tall and slim, and herself, Caroline, as being short and portly. When Mary brought Caroline's breakfast up to her, like a slatternly girl at between 2 and 3, Caroline said the only words that passed between them was Mary saying, "I cancelled the coach for 5 p.m. because I have a headache and the weather looks threatening." And Caroline said she was sorry she had done so. Mary then left without a word. Her reply sounds innocent enough. Caroline was sorry for her sister's headache, is the implication in one of her accounts. In another it seems to be irritation at her having cancelled the carriage. It was another friction point. Mary had sabotaged her plans. She had countermanded her sister's order for a coach. Caroline's riposte was probably a little more candid than her saying she was sorry that she had done so, which later became that she was sorry for her sister's headache, in certain accounts. It was a spiteful move by Mary, spitefully received by Caroline. The fact that Mary said she had no further conversation in the room after this is also suggestive that all was not well between the women. Caroline got up. Her dinner had better be on the table. What occurred to make things reach the point of crisis is unknown. It could be anything, because such a situation is waiting for an excuse. It awaits a sharp word, a perceived insult, a moment of studied neglect. Dumb insolence even. It came that afternoon, in a flurry of words, and violence quickly followed. Quickly, because these two women had spent a lifetime of restraint in their words. When the breach came, it would be physical. The use of the hammer is instructive here. It implies that one of the women had procured this for the purpose of attacking the other, or else of defending themselves. It had been taken from a shed, or possibly a barrow, that morning. How this was done we do not know, but if the bricklayer's labourer, Cumnor, was correct, then it was done that morning in the avenue, just around the corner from Heathfield, and the only one of the two sisters in the habit of going out in the morning was Mary. She must surely have walked past the barrow and noticed the hammer unattended, and taken it. She had it for a purpose, and it was wrapped in merino cloth. A charwoman who had once worked for the sisters said that Mary wrapped a hammer in cloth to break coal so as not to wake her sister. But this was the 11th of June. There were no fires being lit at this time of year, and especially in the houses of miserly women. Why wrap it in cloth? It was a weapon, and she knew the splintering of coal could be reduced by the muffled hammer, so it could reasonably be expected to do the same with blood. Whatever the precise sequence of events, Mary had a set to with her younger sister, and violence ensued in which she hit her about the head. This seems to have occurred in the scullery in the basement. One or both women were in there at some point after the injuries had been inflicted, said Professor Pepper. That was an inescapable conclusion because of the blood spatter and bloody hand and palm prints of one or both women there. It is possible to go further, though. The fight commenced there, and this view is reinforced by the fact that this is where the knife almost certainly resided, and this is the only way in which the narrative can follow a logical sequence. In the course of the fight, Caroline got the better of her sister. She was younger, larger, in a different weight division. Mary ran upstairs from the scullery, bloodied, pursued by her sister, who seized a knife. She was clearly trying to flee through the front door when she was either felled first or grabbed, and seething with pent-up rage of years of frustration, Caroline cut her sister's throat from behind. She made a half-hearted attempt at her own, too, which caused a superficial flesh wound, but did not sever any arteries or windpipe or vital structures. She then took the knife to the scullery, washed it, dried it, and replaced it in the drawer. She pulled open several drawers in the dining room, paying no attention to their contents whatsoever, and ran out through the front door into the street, crying, "Murder! Murder!" This account explains most of the aspects of the matter which I am able to discern, but I doubt this is exactly what occurred. There are far too many aspects to this mystery to slot every piece of the jigsaw into place. Too many missing pieces make it impossible to complete it. But it is possible to put enough pieces into their proper places to see what the complete picture probably looked like. It was obvious that the police and the coroner and the jury had the gravest of suspicions against Caroline, that she was responsible for both her sister's murder and for her own injuries, although these were described by the press as being severe, and she indicated her delightfully thick and long hair had preserved her from the blows to which her less fortunate, much older sister succumbed, they do not appear to have been life-threatening in nature. There was always the possibility, of course, that a stranger, one of the myriad suspicious characters seen about the area that day, was responsible, but the authorities were not prepared to devote a great deal of time or resources to this theory. To those cognizant of the details, of the lives of the two women, to the circumstances, it was clear enough that Caroline Hogg had got away with the murder of her sister in June 1906. Mary's fortune went to her sister later that year. It may have been the first time she was aware that her sister was not poor, as everyone seemed to think. With the money she possessed herself, Caroline was certainly a wealthy woman now. She left Camberley and returned to Yokohama in Japan. She made a will herself on the 10th of June 1915, leaving her wealth to Cato Benjamin Ahl, head of a Norwegian trading and shipbroking investment firm, with whom she had significant investments. She lived at the Grand Hotel in Yokohama during these years, and was admitted to the General Hospital here in 1921. And it was here she died on the 18th of September that year, at the age of 68. It was the age her elder sister had been when she died 15 years earlier in Camberley, Surrey.